Welcome to the Lübeck Armory. Thanks to the generosity of the museum staff of the St. Gallen Museum in Lübeck, I have the opportunity to present to you a number of interesting one-handed swords of the medieval period. So here we have a few swords, almost none of which is completely preserved. So you see they're in various states of preservation, or shall I say decay. A number of them are broken and crossguards are missing. This one here, single-handed sword of about the 12th century, I'd say. It has a very faint inscription which the camera will be unable to catch right now, but because of this inscription being in yellow metal, I assume that this is a 12th century sword rather than an earlier one, because early inscriptions were in iron while later ones were in yellow metal. It's a very plain sword with a disc pommel, simple flattish disc, and it is also quite a long weapon. Most of the modern reproductions tend to be too short in terms of blades, judging by the number of specimens I have come across over the years. So here we are looking at a blade that has, or a sword that has an overall length of 107 centimeters. So that's quite impressive. It still handles really nicely because it is less than 1200 grams as of now, and there's really no problem in handling it and moving it about as you're supposed to do. So this is a very nice one. Talking about sword length, which is one of the aspects that I want to address today, there are swords that are single-handed yet are more than 100 centimeters overall length, like for instance this 14th century sword here. It has a hexagonal blade cross section, and it's still in pretty good shape, although it snapped in modern times at this point, and there is a modern repair. Today, I think it was a 103 or 104 centimeters overall length. It probably was more like 107 in its heyday. Still a very beautiful and nice weapon, and it's probably early 14th century. So here we have another weapon which is about 107 centimeters originally, and now I'm going to show you one which is probably early 13th century, which has, in comparison to the one I just showed you, has quite a wobbly blade. It's still, in terms of being wobbly, it's still somewhat different comparing to modern reconstruction, modern swords. I cannot really tell you why that is, but for some reason with original swords, the vibration stops earlier. Maybe metallurgists have an idea of why that is. Anyway, we wanted to look at length. Now this sword features another modern repair, rather crude one, but I think that's okay because it's easily being spotted. There are two metal plates on either side, it's probably iron, and then brutally riveted through the blade. But it's easy to spot that this blade was broken. It's probably a river find and was destroyed by an excavator shovel. That's the fate of many a sword. And this sword comes at 117 centimeters overall length. So that's super long, and it's still only 1248 grams. So it's still a really light sword, and you can strike with that sword no problem. It handles really nicely. Yeah, so this is the one thing I wanted to tell you in regards to these swords, that a lot of the medieval one-handed swords are definitely much longer than what we are used to by looking at the produce of modern sword makers, of modern reproductions. Okay, that's the one thing. The other thing is that all these swords appear to be optimized for a specific customer or a specific fighter. All of the handles, all of the pommels are twisted very slightly, But this is for a reason I have outlined in a number of videos before. So the pommel plane is not in the same plane as the sword, as the blade. And that is because the gripping hand is asymmetrical, and the lump of muscle at the base of your thumb will always press pommel to the side. So I'm exaggerating here so that you get the idea. So when I'm pulling a pommel into my palm, then let me turn around so I can show it better. So I'm exaggerating to explain the concept. So if you're gripping the pommel, for instance, because you're fully extending the sword, be it as the end position of a blow, or be it because you are actually thrusting, then the pommel resting in the hand will be pushed away from the lump of muscle at the base of the thumb, and it will be pulled towards the pinky and the ring finger. This results in a twist, naturally. Now, to make up for this twist and to predetermine the extended blade as the long edge being aligned with the ulna and not having to correct that by turning your wrist, you can turn and put the pommel onto the tang in an offset position to begin with from the very start. That means that there are swords that are optimized for right-handers, and there are also swords that are optimized for left-handers. Now this sword here has, if you can see it, this pommel here is offset, and it is offset in a clockwise direction. That means that it is a left-handed sword. Okay? If I fully extend this sword as a right-hander, so if the camera woman would step further away from me. So if I extend this sword as a right-hander fully and hold it by the pommel, then this will ultimately twist the blade quite considerably. So the edge is no longer aligned perfectly. Now the same sword held with the left hand, everything's fine. I can do that perfectly. So you can see that if you look at the crossguard. Now this crossguard is not this crossguard is loose, so I'm trying to fix it with my index finger. I'll do it again on this side. So if you just look at the crossguard here, now the crossguard is at an angle, and so is the blade. That is if a right-hander wields that sword. And here, same thing. Holding the sword partially by the pommel as a left-hander, everything's fine. So this feature is not with this sword only, it's with all these swords. Yeah, it's you can see it with all these swords. If you look at this really nice 14th century type 16 sword, then you can see that the peening of the tang is really nicely carried out, and this peening is naturally, of course, the end of the tang, so you can see the orientation of the tang through this rectangular peening and compare it to the angulation of the pommel. And apparently this pommel is by no means symmetrical and not at all parallel to the plane of the blade. So again, we're looking at an offset pommel. This one is optimized for right-handers. Yeah, so this sword would work for me. It is optimized for a right-hander. So if I'm extending that and for demonstrational purposes align the top terminal of the crossguard at a 12 o'clock direction, then everything that nicely works for me, because that is a pommel with a clockwise and counterclockwise twist, as opposed to using it with my left hand. You can see that will ultimately result in a nasty twist and a wrong angulation of the blade. Okay, so and this is true for all the swords that we see here, regardless of periods. They start at around 1100 and go on to 1300. And in fact, it is something that you find even on later swords, if they are one-handed and if they have disc or wheel pommels. It also is true For very early swords, namely Viking Age swords, there it is even more apparent. But I'm going to cover that in another video. So we've talked about length of medieval one-handed swords. There are swords that are considerably longer than what the average modern practitioner is used to. We talked about offset pommels that define handedness, or to say it the other way around, they're customized, they're optimized for the wielder, for the fighter, and when he's left-handed you can tell by the orientation of this offset, and if he's right-handed respectively. So finally, we are going to look at something which is a rather new discovery of mine, is that the pommels are oftentimes not meeting the tang in the center, even if looking at them in profile. Okay, so you usually have, if you look at the pommels, so assuming this is a pommel here, and if we turn it and then tilt it like so, and here's where the tang enters, this entering of the tang going into the cavity, piercing the pommel, that is not in the center. It is somewhat offset too, creating a wider side and a smaller side of the pommel. I'm going to show you with some of the pommels here. Now this is a really obvious one here. So the part that is facing downwards now, that's the wider part, and the part that's facing up, that's the more shallow, narrower part. And I have tried out the swords, just picked them up and played around with them, and I find that if the wider part is facing towards the palm, it's much nicer to hold the sword, as with the narrower part towards the palm. Then it feels like I lose control more easily. This is just a suggestion, something that I just recently, well, just now found out. It would require some other swordsmen to provide me with their impression if there is a preferred side, which side they'd like to have in their palm and which side they'd like to control with the smaller fingers. If you look at this pommel here, in profile, it is not symmetrical either. There's a wider side and there is a more narrow side. And again, if I hold this sword, there's always a preferred side. So this is what I do. I just turn it around in my hand to find out which side I find more convenient. Now with it, sometimes it's really difficult to say. But in general, the impression that I got is the wider side towards the palm is nicer, particularly if the swords have relatively short handles. So the longer the handle, the different, of course, the feeling of the sword. And I find that with the smaller handles, it's nice to have the wider side of the pommel towards the palm. So if this was true, then that would mean that by the design of the hilt and the slight modification of symmetry, the manipulations to customize the functionality of the blade, by design you would be able to determine not only handedness. So if we look at this sword, for instance, and this is, as I said, this is a right-handed sword, but if it's true that there is a pommel side that feels nicer when it is turned towards the palm, and let me try again. Yeah, pretty clearly this one feels nicer. And yes, it's the wider side. So if I have determined which side of the pommel faces the palm, then I have also determined which edge faces up and which faces down. Yeah. So that means everything with this sword is predetermined. It's a right-hander's sword, and this is the long edge, this is the short edge. And with this knowledge, given that it proves true by creating a much larger database, we can look at edges, for instance. We can see which edges have been honed more. Like with this particular sword, well, the camera can impossibly capture it, but the edge that I believe is the long edge has more honing on this part of the long edge. That's just an observation. You make of it what you want, but it feels like there was more sharpening and more polishing on this part of the long edge, which is where you usually have a lot of defensive blade contact in binds. Yeah, so these are the latest observations. So it seems like just with all the swords that I looked at, they are optimized for the fighting. They're sophisticated instruments and very refined weapons. Thank you very much for your interest and for your ongoing support.